Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the first round topic for Year 11s in the Brisbane competition for this year, which is a long prep topic on the topic that you can see on the screen, that we oppose the ideal that one ought sacrifice themselves for the greater good. As with all of these videos, we're just going to go through the same things as we always do. We're going to look at the context behind the debate, specifically why this debate is taking place. We're then going to look at the questions you need to ask yourselves in setup. Then we're going to get into brainstorming points, structuring your points as a practice activity, and then some debating tips and questions along the way. Throughout the recording, I recommend that you pause on each slide if there's an activity that you think you can do with your team. For example, if you want to have a go answering some of the questions I'm asking before I give you an answer, just so you can sort of practice doing that activity yourself as well. So to start off with, you need to ask yourself the question, what is the context behind this debate? And this is the sort of question you ask in terms of what you should research before you even start thinking of your model, before you start thinking of your points. What do you need to know before anything happens in this debate? There are a few questions I think you should ask. I think the first thing that you should ask is just, what is the concept of the greater good? Because I think it probably refers to like some kind of thing that is greater than just yourself, but what is the scope of it? Do people tend to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of all of society or just for specific things? Probably this debate works best if teams interpret it to mean as much as possible, but still ask yourself this question. Secondly, ask yourself, where is this ideal supported? And what I mean by this is, if you think of all of the times when people do acts of sacrifice, whether it is like their entire life or whether it's just certain opportunities or money that they might sacrifice, what is encouraging them to do this? Is this an ideal that is told to us by leaders in specific places? Is it politicians? Is it people in like positions of power in religion? Is it supported by parents? Is it supported by teachers? Is it something that is entirely internal that we support ourselves? Where is the influence coming from? And additionally, we've got a couple of possible questions here, like, is it through media, like books, films, and TV shows? Is it through schools, through religion? And then the third thing that you want to ask yourself is, do people tend to already live their lives as if they follow this? And the importance of this is that because you are saying that you oppose the ideal, that does not mean that under the status quo, people support it universally and they will always sacrifice themselves. It's sort of a question of people being glorified when they do. So that means that affirmative does not need to defend people always sacrificing themselves. They need to support that more than the affirmative team does. But ask yourself the question, how strong is this ideal? How persuasive is it? Do people currently follow it a lot? Do they currently not follow it much? And how do different groups of people react to this ideal? And so one possible example of this is, it's possible that some people use this narrative to encourage other people to do things. Let's say that you are a teacher and you are encouraging a student to do something because it's good for the whole class, even if it means you need to give up your own personal break time. But it might be that that person, the person that is encouraging a person that is going to follow the ideal, might not be trying to follow the ideal. So maybe different groups of people, depending on how much power they are in, react differently to the ideal. Maybe people in religious groups follow this ideal a lot more than people who are not. Just as a possible example, ask yourself the question of how different groups are going to react to this ideal. Having done all of this setup, the next thing that you need to do is you need to start to define the debate. And there are always a few words that you want to try and define in any given topic. The first one that you want to define in this particular debate is oppose. Now, we'll get to this on the next slide about models, because there isn't a model in this debate. But oppose broadly means that you think that the world would be a better place if we did not have this ideal. You do not need to say that you are banning it. You do not need to say that you are trying to stop people following it, because you are not doing anything. You are just saying that the world would be better if it did not exist. The second thing is the ideal. And again, this means not that you oppose people sacrificing themselves for the greater good. It means that you oppose that thing being idealized. The difference is quite subtle, and inevitably it means that the affirmative team does oppose people sacrificing themselves a lot more than the negative team does. But specifically, you oppose the fact that people sort of glorify it and people use it to persuade people to act. And so the difference here is that compared to someone out of their own want sacrificing themselves, you are opposing people sort of encouraging sacrifice in other people through the existence of this ideal. The third thing is sacrifice. Now, sacrifice, it's probably very easy in this debate to think of it as meaning sacrificing someone's life. You look at the reason why people, for example, join the military, that they think that they are going to sacrifice themselves for a noble cause, and they're sacrificing themselves entirely. But it can also mean smaller things. And I think that this debate is definitely about those smaller things as well. Say, for example, people who adopt positions of authority in religions often sacrifice things such as they might need to take like a vow of silence if you're a monk in certain religions, or you may be encouraged to, through religion, to sacrifice some of your material possessions for the greater good of society. Potentially, some would say that donating to charity is, on a small scale, a sacrifice that one person takes by giving up some of their money or some of their possessions to other people that they believe need it more. A final type of sacrifice could be some kind of opportunity that you sacrifice. Say people choosing to take up positions, take up jobs such as being a teacher or a nurse. Those are jobs that really directly help a lot of people, but might not be paid as much as other jobs that use the same kind of expertise. Someone who is incredibly skilled at maths, choosing to be a maths teacher as opposed to an engineer where they would probably get paid quite a bit more, is likely making some form of sacrifice. You might similarly think of the sacrifices that parents make in terms of if they, when they have children, need to take time out of working, that sacrifices some of their career prospects in order to care for their children. Note that these are all different types of sacrifice. The debate is probably about all of them in different quantities. And we'll get to this in a bit in terms of comparing all of them. And the final thing is just the greater good. This could refer to society, it could refer to smaller scale things. So for example, if we look back at the really ultimate sacrifice of people being prepared to die in war to help the greater good of society, it's clear that the greater good is like the country they come from. But it could be that the greater good is just sort of more people than just yourself. You see again the example of parents sacrificing their livelihoods for the greater good is the greater good of a couple of children. It's not as many people, but it is still a greater good in terms of it helps more people than just themselves. Some would even say that the greater good is just greater in that it goes beyond yourself, and it does not even need to be more people than just you. If one person, for example, is willing to go into a burning building to try and save someone, even though that is a very dangerous thing, and they might only be saving one person, the idea that they are sacrificing themselves for something more than just themselves, even though it might just be one other person, could still be the greater good. So think through all of these words, because lots of these words can mean lots of different things, and think about how they will inform your points. The next thing to look at is your stance. And note, stances are different from models. A model is a type of stance, but a stance goes beyond it. And by a stance, what I mean is what you stand for in this debate. Because it is an oppose motion, it is not a policy motion, there is no should word in the topic, the affirmative team cannot have a model because they are not changing the world in any way through an action. Instead, they are considering something that exists in the world that they would rather not exist. This means that the stance is a bit different. It largely comes down to two things. Firstly, characterizing what exactly the ideal that is being opposed is. That is part of your stance, clarifying what it is that you oppose. And therefore, as the negative team, in the same way, you want to have an idea of what it is that you support because you are not opposing it. And you want to make sure that those two teams are arguing on as similar ground as possible. The second thing that you need to think about is, if this ideal didn't exist, what would exist instead? because this can change the debate quite a bit. As the affirmative team, you want to say that this ideal is bad and it is worse than whatever would have existed instead. Whatever existed instead might be people being encouraged to be incredibly selfish. Maybe that's what would have existed instead. Maybe what would have existed instead is actually society not having an opinion on whether or not you should sacrifice yourself. Importantly, this is something that the teams can disagree on, and it will often be part of the debate. As you can see here, the negative team has a couple of questions that they need to answer in terms of a stance. Firstly, do they support the ideal? I would always recommend answering this question with yes. Wherever possible, it is good to support the thing that the other team is opposing. But even if the norm is imperfect, a negative team can still win if they can prove that something worse would have existed instead. If something worse would have existed instead, then that means that the negative team can still win the debate by saying that this possibly bad ideal is better than the alternative. So those are the kinds of questions you need to be asking in terms of your stance. The next thing to do is to start to brainstorm your point ideas. And importantly in this debate, it's likely that you are going to keep on thinking of examples of times when this norm or this ideal exists. You're going to keep on thinking of examples, and you want to see how you can turn each of them into different types of arguments. So say, for example, the really big scale sacrifices that people make. Is there an argument about the really big scale sacrifices? Is there a different argument about the very small scale sacrifices that people make in terms of like sacrificing your time to help your family, even if it's not your entire life? Those are probably quite different points, so think if you can think of them in terms of different points. This is a good point to pause the video as well. If you're watching this with your entire team, it's a good point to pause and to brainstorm together and then share your ideas. If you're watching this video by yourself, it's also still a good time to pause, brainstorm a few ideas, and then move on to the next slide where I'm going to explain the next concept to you. So you want to consider who are the different stakeholders that we should care about, and these are all of the different people that are affected by this ideal. So they could be governments that are affected by this ideal, because maybe voters vote based on wanting to sacrifice things for the greater good, and that means political parties change their policy platforms based on this. It might be individual people that are affected by it. It might be militaries, it might be religions, it might be schools, it might be families. How will all of these different groups be affected by it? Once you've done that, you then want to share your ideas. Obviously, this is a part where sharing ideas happens in the Zoom calls when we do QDU Academy. If you're in a team, you can share your ideas. Otherwise, just keep your ideas and then you can share them with your team when you next have a meeting. But regardless, pause this video if you are sharing ideas before we move on to the next thing. The final thing is to look at structuring your argument. A couple of things to note here. Firstly, you want to always in this kind of debate explain specifically towards the end of your argument why each example that you have is more persuasive than other examples. Because the reality is that it's probably the case that there are a lot of examples where this ideal exists, and many of them are good for the affirmative team, and many of them are good for the negative team. The team that wins is going to be whichever team can persuade the adjudicator that the occasions where the ideal is good or bad are more important. There are a few ways that I think you can think of to make your arguments really important at the end of your point. One of them is to talk about how common these decisions are made. So say, for example, if you are the negative team, you might celebrate all of the really small sacrifices people make. And you might say that it's more important that we have lots of donations to charity than a couple of people die because they sacrificed their entire lives, even though the lives are like a bigger sacrifice than donating a small portion of your money to charity. It happens a lot more frequently, and so it adds up over time. On the other side, the other team might want to say that their argument is the most important because it is the biggest impact on a scale of per times it happens. Sacrificing your life is a very, very big thing. It's probably the biggest impact each time this ideal is actualized. And so if you can prove that that is the right or the wrong decision, that might be a very, very compelling impact. So make sure you think about why each of your examples is going to be more persuasive than the other team's example, rather than ending the debate with both teams just giving a list of things. Finally, when you're responding to the argument, you also want to be quite comparative. Try and explain why the other team's argument is wrong. Maybe their argument is, or why it is unimportant. Each time the other team has an example of when this ideal is used, you're probably going to agree that the ideal will inform their decision making. Where you are likely to disagree is whether it should and whether the outcome is justified by the ideal that it helps the greater good. And so that means that I think both teams want to think about trying to turn as many of the other team's examples into benefits or harms. So try and avoid doing pieces of rebuttal, which is like, this might be good, but, or this might be bad, but. Just say that it is bad or that it is good for your team. This is the part of the PowerPoint where we would ask for any questions if we were in the Zoom call. Obviously, because you're watching this as a video, you cannot access this because I am not physically here talking to you. But if you do have any questions about this debate, always make sure to reach out to the QDU and we'll see if we can answer your question. And finally, I'll just plug the QDU's resources. Obviously, you've already found the YouTube channel if you are watching this video, but that means that you can also find all of the other really useful videos that we have up here. So make sure to stick around to see future videos that we upload about future topics. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you do well in your next debate.